for retro archiving projects. Looks like a Commodore 1541 disk drive, right? So the 1541 and the 1540 drives were floppy drives for the Commodore 64, and actually the 1540 was for the VIC. Although it worked on the Commodore 64, there were some differences between both. But the looks like the 1541 anyway. So what this is it's a Raspberry Pi based bare metal Commodore 1541 emulator for an SD card. So I've got an SD card here with the software on it, so the ROMs that essentially drives this whole machine. Inside it's got a Raspberry Pi 3. And on top is a Pi 1541 hat. So it has two of the serial buses on it, and it has a little screen, and you can actually program this to be drive 8 or drive 9. So on the Commodore 64, you load a program, load whatever the program name is, or star for the first program on the disk, comma 8 from drive 8. The printer was, I believe, device number 4, and then other devices had their own numbers as well. So yeah, this emulates a 1541 drive perfectly. The 1541 is an interesting drive. It's a computer unto itself. It has its own processor and way of talking to it. It had some bugs in it. So Commodore had intended that drive to work a lot faster over the serial bus to the Commodore 64. And unfortunately, it was quite slow for what it was and what it was meant to be. However, programs such as the Super Snapshot cartridge or Epyx Fast Load would fix that bug and allow the computer to load from the drive very quickly. It was pretty epic, those fast loaders. There were even software-based fast loaders that I used and would often use, and instead of using the cartridge, and they worked beautifully. But for some of the software protection, so for copy protection and stuff, they would often be, and even also to run some of the programs, they would rely on the timing of the Commodore 64 to 1541 drive. So if you were running an emulation or running off another drive that was compatible, but not actually a Commodore 1541, sometimes the programs wouldn't load, they would crash, etc. So the 1541 was pretty ubiquitous for any Commodore 64 user, despite the fact that there were others available. Commodore even made two other new models for, when the Commodore 64C came out. So they had the 1541C, which was sort of a white case, but very similar in design. And there was the 1541-2, which was much smaller form factor and actually had dip switches on the back. So you could actually, rather than cutting traces or using software to change the number of the drive, you can actually finally flip dip switches and actually change the drive number without making hardware modifications to your 1541. That was huge for people that were running BBSs or bulletin board systems, essentially using up dial-up modems to connect to someone else's computer and interact with others on message boards and things like that. There were a number out there. So my friend Dean ran one, my friend Mike ran one. I very briefly ran one. Again, apologies to my grandmother for tying up the one and only phone line between certain hours, and she would get mad because the phone would ring outside of those hours with a carrier tone that was blasting in her ear. So, yeah, I'm sorry. So, yeah, BBSs were huge at that time. And in fact, I think Run Magazine at one point, and I need to find this article, said that the GTA, so the Greater Toronto Area, the Greater Toronto Hamilton Area, GTHA, was huge in computing. It was like the number one area for home computing. in the world, or at least within North America. I will get that clarification because it is an epic article. And I was really quite proud of being part of that. However, BBSs were huge because it allowed us to interact and share software, public domain software. I'll talk about hacking and where is running and stuff in a few minutes, but at least share public domain software. And that's how we built community in many respects. So it was pre-internet, and yet we were all on, a number of us, I should say, were online through BBS's direct dial-up, etc. My friend Robert also ran one and had connections to something called FidoNet. So I don't want to get too out there on BBSing, but I think it's worth doing a video just dedicated to talk about BBSing, modems, and stuff like that. A number of people pre-2000, I would say, will remember carrier tone. Beep, 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 beep. Yeah. I remember the days when it was just beep, beep, and they would just talk. But then the negotiation of 56K, yeah. We can talk about modems another time. So yeah, that's how we built community and how we learned about software and learned about computers from each other and got help. So the other way people connected were through user groups, such as the Toronto Pet Users Group, especially in the Commodore world. So people would get together and totally geek out. Some would bring their computers in and do a demo for their peers and friends, and that's how we connected and how we built community, by getting together and sharing our ideas, sharing what we're doing, and word of mouth. Word of mouth actually also was important as part of that socialization in those early days of 8-bit computing. And of course, shows in Canada such as Bits and Bytes, figureheads like Jim Butterfield. I actually met him at the World of Commodore. He walked by me and I kind of fanboyed. The first time I had ever actually done that. But he was huge in the Commodore and in the Toronto community around Commodore computers, etc. Definitely a well-respected expert on the topic. So I made reference to a show where I got this from. So what show am I talking about? Well, Christmas is coming up and December is all about Christmas, right? Well, in the Commodore world, at least here in Toronto, it's also World of Commodore season. So in the 80s, Commodore ran a trade show that ran typically the December 1st weekend, that first weekend of December, at the International Center, which is about, I'd say, 10 minutes away from here. And they would have all kinds of vendors. That's where they would showcase their new machines. It's where all of us came together every year to actually sort of buy new software, see the latest hardware, and see what was out there. And it was like computer Christmas. It totally was. And it was also put together, I believe, in conjunction with the Toronto Pet Users Group. And to this day, the World of Commodore still runs. And it's funny, I'm feeling emotional about it. So I would have gone to my first one in 1984 with my friend Paul and his father, and it was like computer heaven. It was amazing, and I really appreciate them taking me then, and I still appreciate them taking me now. However, I actually I've been to the past 2 or 3, well, not counting the pandemic, right? But certainly the past 2 years and one just before the pandemic, I've been going to the World of Commodore, which the Toronto Pet Users Group, or tpug, they're available at tpug.ca, and I'll put a link to them down in the description of the video. they still run the World of Commodore. It's pretty epic. And they do it at the Admiral Hotel, and it's coming up in a few weeks from the recording of this video. So I suspect I'm going to go visit and actually see what's there. I may actually buy some old software because there were some classics that I've always wanted to play, although I probably have them on my retro arcade machine upstairs and could play them on there. So do I really need the physical software? But I'll think about it. So, but it's neat to see what's out there, especially in terms of emulation for different Commodore machines, seeing the old Commodore machines just in the flesh and what people are doing to preserve history and things like that. There are also seminars on different aspects of whether it's history, maintaining machines and other topics, and also talking original engineers such as Bill Hurd and David Haney, talking about their contributions to engineering within Commodore. And even Jack Trammell's sons still attend some of the shows. Yeah. It's kind of neat hearing that the Trammell sons are still sort of talking about history and talking a little bit about their father and some of the his history, because he's quite an interesting character, having survived the Holocaust, gotten out of Europe and into North America, and then built this empire of sorts, and in many respects built the computer for the masses, so which was one of his goals, and he did that with the Commodore 64, especially with how many actually sold. Many years ago, when we were at a bookstore, Mom wanted to buy us a series of books, and I admit I wasn't much of a reader. I didn't care much for fantasy, which the rest of my family adored. Definitely more of a science fiction guy. I've got copies of E.T. and Tron that I would get during the summer and read those while camping every year. But what I asked for was this guide. So this is the Programmer's Reference Guide. And what it does is it covers everything about BASIC on the Commodore 64. It covers graphics. So things like standard high resolution bitmap mode. 320 by 200, anyone? High resolution. It was in those days, and just very clear, despite how blocky it looks on this 4K monitor, and also widescreen. 320 by 200 was huge back in the day, and 16 colors. Yeah, that was pretty epic. Although there were other computers that I think had better color options. So I think the Atari 800 may have 6:1 on the Apple II. Yeah, how to generate sound, and it talks a lot about the envelope generator, which is huge with sound and on the Commodore 64 and the SID chip. There were two main supporting processors on the Commodore 64, and it's something I'm going to talk about in the Amiga video. About the use of coprocessors back in sort of the late 70s, 80s for computers. I mean, the Atari computers had their own coprocessors for graphics and sound. Many computers had a dedicated sound chip. Commodore had the SID chip, and they had the VIC chip for video. So video interface chip and the sound interface device. So at that time, coprocessors for specific purposes were well understood and well used by the time the Commodore 64 came out. So anyway, that's the Programmer's Reference Guide. It also does cover electrical characteristics about the machine. It covers things about like the user port. So the user port on the back of the machine, and yes, this is, it's missing the screws. The user port, where the modem plugged in, could be used for, I kind of said this could have been the Raspberry Pi of the time. You can control devices with the edge connector here. So kind of like GPIO. You've got the cassette port, by the way, you've got the serial bus, you've got the video, so composite video. Everybody who says, I can't say it. I'm used to saying composite, but when I hear composite, people are saying composite. Composite people, not composite, composite. Anyway, the composite port, television, so RF, and then the cartridge port. So, it had a number of different ways that you connect to the outside world in different use cases. But that user port, had I realized what that user port could have been used for, I would have maybe taken the time to learn electronics more than I did. Again, I focused more on the software because I was afraid I would mess up the my computer. And there was one point where I feel like I don't remember if it was me or what the scenario was, but I remember on my Commodore 64 the fuse going, and I thought the computer died. And we had seen, oh, there's a fuse in there, and it had broken. So replace the fuse, and everything's been golden ever since, until it died with whatever ailment it has. But yeah, that was kind of a weird time period. It's like, oh my gosh. So I've always been kind of afraid of hardware. And, as a kid, I would take stuff apart to see how it sort of worked. So with calculators that were LCD based, I'd flip the glass because of the polarity. So I'd have a black display with white characters versus sort of whatever sort of white background with black characters. So, but yeah, I would break stuff, unfortunately. So, but I've learned how to solder, and all is good. Anyway, that's the Programmer's Reference Guide. Another book that I have is Crazy Games for Your Commodore 64. So I entered a number of programs from this book. This really takes me back. But the other thing, like in terms of games, many of you have heard about Electronic Arts, right? So they're huge in the industry, and many of you have heard about Activision. Microsoft just bought them. And if you had told me that in the 80s, that in 40 years, Activision would have been bought out by Microsoft, I would have laughed. Because they're business software and operating systems in BASIC. So, however, Electronic Arts. So they had the sort of the stylized ECA, EOA. I always thought it was EOA, but think about it, it's like there's no O. Well, there is electronic, but is it ECA or EOA? I have no idea. But the square, the sphere, and let's say the cube, the sphere, and the pyramid logo. They had really iconic artwork for their software. Wasteland. I always want a copy. In fact, I think I got this, at the last World of Commodore. Wasteland was a game that I always wanted to play. I've always started it, but I've never finished it. It's kind of like Bard's Tale. I actually finished Bard's Tale, which was also by Electronic Arts, which is available for modern platforms today. And it's interesting seeing that. The Tales of Scarborough. Anyway, so yeah, and this was actually compatible with the Commodore C64 and the 128 in 64 mode. Ultimate Wizard. I played this game a lot. And actually it still has the manuals inside. So this actually still have, wow, the original packaging. I bought this for $19.99 at Zeller's. Wow. Way back in probably the 80s. And it actually has Quantum Link. You too can get started. Anyway, nostalgia. Huge amount of nostalgia. Anyway, and then finally, so that was Ultimate Wizard, and then finally Skater Die, which I think this was given to me by my friend Mike at one point when he was getting rid of his Commodore 64. So Electronic Arts had a real design language around their packaging. They looked like records, and the game disc would be in here, and then you'd have the guide or other stuff inside the envelope. So yeah, I have a number of their games here. My goal as a kid with a Commodore 64 was to collect every Electronic Arts game. Not only them, but also Epyx. So Epyx was another company that made games and peripherals for the Commodore 64. So they are known very much for their joysticks. Their joysticks were amazing. The 500XJ, I've got one. I will pull it out in a minute. But their games were epic. So, ha ha ha. Epic. Yeah. But yeah, they were amazing games. And I wanted to collect as much of their games as possible because they were high quality. Especially around that time when the video game crash happened. So Commodore 64 came out 82, the video game crash was what, 84? So kind of rough for video games. And there were some really horrible video games out there. There were some really horrible software publishers that were not treating the game designers well. Imagine that. You still hear the same thing today, long hours, etc. I mean, video game productions are as I said, a production today, and I very much appreciate the sweat and tears and everything that goes into video game development today, and what went into it back then and in between. So hats off to game developers of yesteryear and current. But yeah, they were amazing games. And so this is an Epyx 500 XJ joystick. This one's actually a Sega version, but is compatible with the Commodore 64. And it looks like this. These were joysticks to lust after. Every kid wanted one. And why did they want them? Partially the click key, the whole micro switch thing. The buttons were, it was ergonomic. It fit in the palm of your hands beautifully. The versions I actually had, other than this one, I actually have two of these. With the Sega, it has two buttons, so A and B and all the directions, and also this one's got auto fire. Epic. Haha. But yeah, the original just had a single button and just the one joystick, and it was beautiful because it fit in the palm of your hands, and you could just focus on firing at enemies using your trigger finger, and some people are used to the gamepads. I actually like gamepads, and especially with the analog sticks that they have today. This is very digital, so 4 or 8 direction depending on the game, etc. But it's funny actually starting to play some of the old games I used to on a gamepad versus a joystick, because the gamepads are actually more responsive. At least that's what I've found. So I can get through levels a little bit easier with a gamepad, etc. With some of the joysticks that I had, so I had a Suncom. I can't remember the actual name, but it was orange, and that too had, I think it had micro switches. Certainly, that's my recollection, but I don't actually know. I'll have to look that up. I had a Wiko Boss, so it was a gray joystick with a lot of, you really had to push it over, etc. And it had a big button on top. So typical joystick, fire button on top, etc. But this was different, like much shorter throw with the joystick. The buttons again being, it was just a beautiful ergonomic joystick. And yeah, these were the joysticks to lust after. The ones that come with the V64, they're not bad. I understand that they're quite iconic in Europe, but they certainly weren't that iconic over here for whatever reason. The keyboard on this was not great. Somehow I managed to deal with it. I learned to type on this properly. And I did actually have to maintain the keyboard. Often I'd have to take it apart with all those screws. So the one thing I didn't mess up was my Commodore 64. You would actually have to take the keyboard apart and actually on the connectors, take an eraser and actually use an eraser to clean the actual contacts. So the keyboard was kind of painful to use from that angle, and was well loved and well used. If I were to restore this, I'd probably try and probably clean the keyboard, although I may want to actually replace the keyboard, which it is certainly possible to do these days through the retro enthusiast community. So yeah, that's certainly possible to do for sure. But yeah, not a great keyboard. So why anybody would want to relive the keyboard experience? Okay, I kind of get it. It's kind of big and chunky, and that sound is iconic. So, you know, and I think having learned to type on this actually set me up for being able to type faster on a regular keyboard. I do find the spacebar a little difficult to use because I'm just, you know, used to just really tapping it quickly. These, you know, and it sort of occasionally kind of gets stuck because I tend to lean on the right hand side, but actually seems to be behaving. But yeah, I've had a few moments where it's like, you know, did I hit space properly, etc. It's like the Timex Clear 1000. You can't type very quickly on that, partially because of the membrane keyboard. But if you remember the emulation on here, it actually won't accept input that quick. The Commodore 64 is a little bit more robust in that particular department. So, hello everybody. While traveling, I put up a post saying, hey, if you decode this message, and it was 6502 assembly, then I would do shout outs to those people who correctly guessed what my assembly does. So the first thing is you do an LDA, which is load accumulator, to put in the character into the accumulator, and then it was JSR string or $sign FFD2. FFD2 is the essentially the assembly for print a character on the screen in Commodore 64 assembly, so from the ROM. So put one character into the accumulator, print. Next character, print, and it'll actually print the character on screen and then space, character, space, etc. So what the message is a take on Hello World, except hello exclamation mark. So I hope you enjoyed that, and the people that correctly got the answer were Nick Elliott, Christopher Boggs, and my childhood friend who introduced me to the Amiga, Jeff Moss. So I'll be talking about the Amiga in the third set of videos that I'm talking about in terms of my computing history. All right. I hope you enjoyed this, and look out for more little tips and things like that that might get shoutouts for you. All right. I hope you've enjoyed this series on the Commodore 64. If you like what you're seeing, please like and subscribe. And I'd love to hear comments on the series as well. What is your history with the Commodore 64? What are your memories and the things that you did with it? Add that to the comments below and enjoy.